Hey everyone, welcome to our Beyond the Pulpit podcast. We are so excited to be able to have conversations about those things you wouldn't talk about on a Sunday morning, whether it's because, you don't have enough time or, hey, it's a little controversial, it's a little uncomfortable. Well, welcome to Beyond the Pulpit. This is episode 1 of season 2, and we are starting with a bang. We are so excited to have Natalie Runion with us from Raised to Stay. She is such a blessing to the church, to the world, and so thank you so much for being with us today. And you'll also be with us in a couple months for our conference, Sisterhood Conference, but great to have a conversation with you. So thanks for being here. Love to hear a little bit about yourself. Tell everybody about you.
Well, thanks for having me. It has been so fun getting to know you guys and your church family, and I look forward to getting to partner with you all in a few months. I'm Natalie. I live in Cincinnati, Ohio, grew up as a pastor's kid. I'm now married to my husband, Tony, for 17 years. We have 2 daughters ourselves, and the last 20 years, the Lord has just taken me personally on a huge journey, going from pastor's kid, didn't want to go into ministry, ended up at a public university majoring in kinesiology and exercise physiology, where I basically fought for my faith for 5 years and got involved with a little organization called Campus Crusade for Christ on campus. And it ended up saving my life, I think. They invited me to be a worship leader. I started leading worship and really fell back in love with the church on my own terms, not as a pastor's kid, but as a campus student, really. I was bivocational until I was 35. And then at 35, the Lord opened the door for me to be a full-time worship leader, and did that up until he asked me to do some different things. And, it was those different things, women's ministry particularly, that I ended up going kicking and screaming because I didn't want to do that. But it was through that really hard season of ministry that he gave me Raised to Stay. And Raised to Stay is really just a ministry for those of us in ministry, for us to take a deep, hard look at why it's hard, but also why we can't quit. And so it really has, turned into something I wasn't expecting.
Wow. Yeah. That's amazing. It's just amazing to see and to watch and to, be a part of what God is doing in your life and through your story. And so congratulations on your second book being released. Super, super happy for you. We have that book, The House That Jesus Built. So excited to dive into it. I have read pieces of it, but I haven't read the full thing. So I'm excited to dive into that book. But I love but her first book. Yeah, I remember you just were like, look at this, look at this, look at this, look at this, highlighted all over the place.
All the corners are folded over. I mean, I bawled my eyes out at the last chapter. You have to read it for yourself. But yeah, it's been phenomenal reading and hearing your story about why you chose to stay and why you never quit. And so it's very inspiring for those of us that are in the church. But I want to just talk a little bit about being a pastor's kid. And so we have 3 daughters. We have 3 amazing daughters. And I want, you often call it this brutal beauty, the life as a pastor's kid. So can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, it's the best of life and the worst of life all in one. You are constantly with people. You're constantly with people who love you. And I can remember every holiday, every birthday was marked by church people. And that was the beauty of it. The beauty was that I was never alone. We grew up in church parsonages where we lived on the church property. And there are saints in my life still who have known me since I was born because they were part of our church community. But the brutality of that is that if you love something, it's always possible that it will hurt you. And, I think as kids, we were pretty naive to it. We saw what our parents allowed us to see. And then you get older and you start understanding the code words, and you start understanding the bedroom door shut, and you start understanding the whispering, and you realize that, we've been protected from a lot. And so, being a pastor's kid was a lot of quietly watching your parents go through things you didn't know, how to name. It was also finding your identity outside of that initial PK. It was also trying to figure out, is this my parents' faith or is this my faith?
That's
and
so
so I
really
think
good.
that, some days that was really an easy conversation to have with yourself, and other days not so much.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. What advice would you have for parents that are raising their children in church today? Pastors, kids, or parents in general?
they have their own faith. And that's hard for me as a parent with my daughters right now who are almost 16 and 12 to realize that like my faith in Jesus can't be their faith in Jesus. And so how I came to Jesus isn't going to look how they came to Jesus. I loved youth group. I have one who doesn't. You know, I loved all of the church events. I have one who would also love to be in the church at 24/7. So really understanding that every child has their own unique relationship with Jesus Christ. And in that, they are going to grow differently. They're going to walk differently. They're going to struggle differently. And so we cannot project on our 2025 kids what we went through in 1980, 1990, 2000. We have to let them wander, wonder, and wrestle just as we did and not panic that they're not going to find the same Jesus we found.
That's really good. One of the things that we pray almost every morning is that our kids would have their own faith, that they wouldn't ride on the coattails of our faith, that God would show up to them, with them, and they would have an experience with God like we've had. Like we can share our stories of our faith, but ultimately we want them to have their experiences of faith. And I was remembering you said that one of your kids wants to be in church 24 hours a day. I remember during the COVID shutdown, how impactful that was for our kids. As pastors' kids, you think they'd love not going to church on a Sunday. But after a couple weeks, actually about a month, I remember one of them specifically, and I don't remember which one it was, but one of them specifically was in tears going, can we just go sit in the auditorium? Yeah. We miss it, right? But at the same time, they'll say things like, it's really tough. We just did, in season 1, we did a pastor's kids podcast. We weren't here. We had someone else interview them, and different pastors' kids, including ours, were there and asking them those tough questions and hearing what that life was like. It's actually a really good podcast. And so we appreciate that. That's so important is it's their faith, not ours.
And you said wander, wrestle, and what was the other one? Wonder?
Wonder. Yeah. You know,
yeah. I love that.
Let them do that.
That's so good. That's really good. So let's talk about your books for a minute, because they're both amazing books. And Raised to Stay, I mean, it's powerfully resonated with so many people. Mm-hmm. And now you've released the second book, The House That Jesus Built. So are these books, I think I already know the answer to this, but can you tell us, how they're connected?
Well, Raised to Stay was really an introduction to what it meant to stay. I started this as an Instagram account. I was just trying to convince myself not to quit. I had no intentions of having a book, having a ministry. I was in a season at 40 years old where I wanted to quit ministry really bad. And that's saying a lot after growing up in it, to say it was the hardest season of my life. Like, I told the Lord, I'm done. And it was in that conversation with him that he gave me this phrase, raised to stay. And so I didn't know what that meant. I just knew that it was mine. I knew he had given that to me. And so I started writing to it. And eventually, an agent found me, and then we got a publisher. And so that first book was really kind of like the flagship for the Raised to Stay ministry to say, look, we might wrestle with God's people, but we're going to stay with Jesus. We're not going to quit on each other. So a normal person isn't insane like I am, and they probably wouldn't write 2 books in a year, right? Like that's not like on the bingo card for a lot of us. But when I started looking at the reviews, people were like, okay, that's great. We've healed. We've gone through the process of, dealing with our wounds, but now what? And so The House That Jesus Built honestly just came just as prophetically as Raised to Stay did. And I just started thinking, wow, every time in the scriptures that God asked us to tear something down, he always gave us a plan to rebuild.
So good.
And so the deconstruction movement doesn't have to be bad. We just have to commit to rebuilding. Yeah. And that's really why The House That Jesus Built came out so quickly after Raised to Stay, so that we didn't leave people in the rubble of deconstruction.
Love that.
That's really good. And we've been having those kind of conversations because a lot of times, here's the reality. We know that church hurt exists. We know that we're humans, right? The church is made up of humans and
imperfect humans.
Humans. And one of the things that around our community, especially, there's been a lot of conversation. When I say community, I mean in other churches and out in the community, not just our church, is this whole deconstruction. And there are podcasts out there about, bringing on ex-evangelicals and others who are against the church and really having conversations about why the church is wrong and why you shouldn't go to church and all these other kind of things. And I really like what really resonated with me, and I think resonates with a lot of people, is you're not acknowledging the reality, right? You're saying, yeah, absolutely, there's brokenness in the church, but we can address it, we can work on it, we can heal from it from within the church instead of outside the church, versus people running away. Because that's always the thing we've talked about is, if everybody runs out of the church, then what? Mm-hmm. Right? So I love that. That's just it's so good. So thank you for that.
I think that pastors get scared of the word deconstruction because I think they think it means deconversion. And so when someone comes in and they have deep theological questions regarding religion that was placed on them when they were kids, be it because they were in a cult or they were in a really oppressive church environment, they hear someone saying, well, I'm kind of deconstructing my faith. Well, they're just using that word because it's the only word that's been given to them to put language to what they're doing. But most of us who were raised in the church, who love Jesus, we're not deconstructing, we're detangling. We're just kind of coming undone from some of these things that people put on us, religion put on us, that isn't the Jesus of the Bible that we read. And so I really want to encourage pastors to not be afraid of that word and to be willing, and leaders, everybody, to just each other's friends, to be able to sit down over coffee and let people wonder and wrestle like we just talked about without us panicking. That they're leaving their faith.
Yeah, that's really good. And even as parents, right? We've had conversations with our daughters, specifically our older one, where she's wrestling with it, right? And being able to say, even though we're her parents and her pastors, right, to be able to have a safe place to have that conversation. And, even the conversations about the things that are happening in the church, very popular, well-known pastors who have made poor decisions, immoral decisions, unethical decisions, and we're seeing that happen. It feels like it's happening every week, right? And then we live in this cancel culture so because of the failure of a man or of a woman, right? Then we're going to cancel the entire church. We're going to say church in general is wrong. In one of our buildings, our broadcast location, we took down the cross that was on the steeple and we put up a cross equals heart. And when people asked me why we did that, I said, when people drive by this building, I don't want them on the highway. I don't want them to look at it and associate it with the hurt that they had growing up, but really to associate it with what it really means, is that Jesus is a God of love and he loves you. And so my question to you in regards to this whole cancel culture thing is, what is your advice in when people we're living in this cancel culture, we're seeing the failures of so many pastors and leaders in the Christian world. How does someone stay rooted? Like, what is not the trick or the secret ingredient, but how does somebody stay rooted in that throughout all of this? How do you stay?
I think in John 15, whenever I read that, I always think of this idea that, we are the branch. The branch doesn't produce the fruit, the vine does. So when we get disconnected from the vine, be it through our own life choices, disappointment, disillusionment with the church, whatever that might be, we stop bearing fruit when we are disconnected from the vine. And so I have to tell people all the time, look, I have disconnected from church before. I've disconnected from Bible studies before, but I've always had to stay connected to Jesus to remind me not only of who I am, but whose I am. And I think that a lot of church hurt happens because we disconnect from the one true vine and we connect to another man's castle. And we go into a church and we see somebody who's charismatic, who has money, who has fame, who has a platform. And so we then attach all of our eggs into this one basket of this one person, and then they fail us, or they abuse us, or they aren't who we thought they were. And that's because we've chosen to attach ourselves to a human over attaching ourselves to the vine. And we have to know that any time that we attach to a counterfeit connection, we will die on that vine.
Wow.
And so for a lot of us to stay rooted, we have to be attached to the one living source that will provide every need according to his riches and glory, and not get so caught up in chasing movements of Jesus that we forget that we are called to follow the message and mission of Jesus, which is the Great Commission. So I think a lot of it is about attachment.
That's so good. And I love that you said the movement of Jesus, right? Because a lot, especially with the younger people, right? The younger people you see in your church, and they're like, oh, but this person's so charismatic, so cool. They have this new thing that they're doing. And then it's like the new shiny object that's in front of them. It looks good, right? But then it kind of pulls them to a different direction. And they're, they're not, maybe they are, they're taking a transplant from their church, and they're kind of following the movement versus staying connected to Jesus himself. So, so that's a super important conversation to have with our young folk. Can we talk a little bit about the difference between church hurt and church abuse? Because you say that not all church hurt is abuse. So can you explain, like, how do we tell the difference between church hurt and church abuse?
I don't know how Raised to Stay became like a church hurt conversation space. I'm glad that it became a safe place for people to have these dialogues, because that was really never my intention, was to try to diagnose people when they came into the ministry through Instagram. You can't know a full story from social media. But one thing I always tell people is there are absolute counseling definitions for what abuse is and what trauma is. And many times those things can't be fully diagnosed until you're in the presence of a licensed counselor. However, we do know that abuse at its very core is anything that harms us physically, spiritually, emotionally, any of those things that affect the core of who we are, that hurts us, harms us in any shape, way, or form. So physically, sexually, emotionally. So narcissistic leadership could be a form of spiritual abuse should you be sitting under that person long enough for them to do emotional damage. I have had friends on staff who have ended up in hospitals before because of their relationship with their oversight. I've had people have to quit because their blood pressure was through the roof. And, even though they weren't being sexually abused, they were definitely being spiritually abused. So when we look at the psychological, physical, emotional health and it being damaged by a person under the guise of religion, scripture, or anything that we are using Jesus as its banner, that is spiritual abuse. And we should report it. All sexual abuse needs to be reported. And I believe there is a special place in hell for shepherds who abuse the sheep. That is just my strong conviction. Church hurt can become church abuse if we stay too long. And this is where people get weirded out by my message, because they're like, well, you're telling us to stay. No, we don't tell people to stay where they aren't safe, right? We don't tell people in abusive marriages to stay where they're not safe. So when we look at church hurt, that is more of people utilizing power and position to keep us psychologically stunted, spiritually numb. It's where we can no longer operate in our callings, because now we're not just having our hearts broken, we're having our spirits crushed by people who are supposed to be our friends, our leaders, our Davids. David and Saul, I think of that relationship. We all want a Paul, but so many times we get the Saul. And so that's where that church hurt comes into play. It can also not be always at the hands of an abuser or a narcissistic leader. It can sometimes be us having unrealistic expectations for what we're walking into in the church. So the pastors and leaders aren't always the ones who are responsible for our hurt. Sometimes we get hurt because we don't clarify expectations. We go in thinking we're going to get something that was never promised to us. And so we become disappointed. And so I tell people a lot of times, I want to challenge you to ask yourself, have I been hurt by the church or disappointed in my expectations of the church?
That's really good. I'm glad you clarified that, because I do feel like sometimes that people put unrealistic expectations on pastors, and they don't clarify things. They don't say actually what they expect from us. And then we fail all the time, right? We can't meet all of the expectations that everybody has on us. So I appreciate that you clarified. Sometimes it's just disappointment,
But, going on that is, what can we because one of the things that we strive to do is to not only be self-aware, but be healthy leaders, develop healthy leaders. One of the things, we've got dreams, we've got visions that we believe God has put into our hearts and goals for the future. But what I've told our team over and over again is, yes, I may have this vision or this dream of 20 campuses in 20 years, but I won't do that on the backs of people. right? And so it's really important for us to be healthy and to lead healthy. And so what would you say, what advice would you give to us and other lead pastors who are like, no, I don't want to be a statistic, but I may have blind spots. Like, what are some things and some thoughts that you can give to help us to be aware of so that we don't fall trap and become a statistic?
Well, just asking the question is huge, because most pastors that are not healthy would never even ask that question. They don't want their foundation inspected because they know there are cracks. So I think just asking the question is a huge green flag for anyone who walks into a church and the pastors say, hey, how can we do this better? So thank you for asking that question. And with the new book, The House That Jesus Built, I've been preaching very specific messages on reconciliation and unforgiveness, because I am convinced that part of the reason the church is in this deconstruction right now is because of unresolved unforgiveness that we've held towards shepherds, pastors, leaders. And that unforgiveness has become bitterness and offense. And that is a lot of our issue in the church today. But just a few weeks ago, I was in a church and I preached one of those messages, and it turned into a 3-hour prayer meeting where the pastors were on the front of the platform, and they were repenting before their congregation for the things that they didn't know had happened, the things that they had kept quiet because they were trying to protect people but ended up hurting people, and the reconciliation that happened just by the pastors themselves standing on a platform and saying what you just said. We're not perfect. We don't catch everything. We don't know everything. Please forgive us for partnering directly and indirectly with those who have hurt you. Forgive us for hurting you. And the revival that broke out in that church afterwards was unbelievable, because that's what God does. He restores his family, you know? So I think for pastors, a few things. Number one, you have to assume that you don't know everything that's happening in your church, because you have paid people and good, trusted people to stand in positions to help be the gatekeepers for your sheep. They know to love your sheep the way you love them, and you are just instinctively trusting them to be able to protect them. So because you don't know anything, you don't know everything, then when another congregant or another staff member comes who isn't at that same level of leadership as those you've placed in position, and they come to you and they say, this leader's hurting me. This leader is not leading me well. This leader is leading me astray. Listening to those people and taking every accusation serious the first time is the most wonderful way you can love your congregation and your team, by taking it seriously the first time and investigating as if it's true until it's proved to be false. And what that does is it puts a trust in your staff and your congregation that you are first there to protect the sheep, not your yes men or the people that they perceive as untouchable at the top. So just take every accusation and concern as if it's true until it's proven that it's not. Number two, for the church to see the pastors publicly repenting or showing humility on the pulpit to say, we're not perfect, we don't get it right all the time, this has been a hard season. I think a lot of pastors are fearful of vulnerability, because they think if they're vulnerable, people will use that. But what I'm learning is that the sheep will only be as vulnerable as their shepherd.
Yeah.
That's really good.
When they see that modeled, then when they're struggling, they're more likely to confess they're struggling, because they've seen how you've walked out your struggle. And then finally, just continuing to be a safe place for everyone, to create pockets of spiritual counsel and wise counsel and spiritual direction, and making sure that the overall health of your team is constantly being checked on. Because, I've had leaders who have been Pauls to some, but they've been Saul to me because I got them in a bad season, and so just making sure that the temperature of your staff is always being checked to ensure that they're not hurting people in an unhealthy season.
Yeah, that's really good.
It's really good.
Going off of that, by the way, thank you for that. I think that's so important. And from your perspective is important, because your perspective comes from being part of a pastor's family, being a pastor's kid, but also being a staff person, also being a church member, right? And also your perspective of going to all these churches and the conversations you're having. And so it's a really good, solid viewpoint that you have that many of us don't. And I love what you said about being transparent, being authentic, being vulnerable, right? I shared this a couple weeks ago in a sermon I was preaching, that late last year, there was someone who was just, broken, being a little bit ugly at that time. And they were talking about my own personal battle with depression and anxiety and emotional abuse growing up. And they were saying that, or alluding, almost saying that it disqualified me from leadership, right? And what I realized, and I wrestled with that over several months after that, was no, that didn't disqualify me, that qualified me. Because as, the wounded healer, Henry Nouwen's, philosophy, right? We can help we're better shepherds, better ministers, better healers when we actually help others heal from through our own brokenness, right? So I really appreciate that. What would you say is what kept you in the church, right? I know you've said some of that, but you've experienced church hurt. You've experienced many times as a pastor's kid watching your parents get hurt by the church, right? Because we talk a lot about the sheep getting hurt, but there's also pastors get hurt, right? There's church hurt for pastors, right? There are some crazy emails that we've received and people have said some crazy things to us that honestly, sometimes we look at each other and go, do they forget we're human too? That we have hearts too? And so for you've got it coming from both sides. What was it like? If you could say it in a sentence or two, like what was it that kept you in the church?
I think it was twofold. It was my deep love for the people of the church, which is crazy because that's usually who I was getting hurt by as a child. But it was honestly the deep love for the church and a deep fear of God. Mm. Because I knew that I had been called and that I would live a life of misery if I was disobedient to that calling. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't the Lord rushing me to get to my destiny or anything like that. It was, I couldn't escape it. It was like that fire shut up in my bones. And so even when I left my full-time church ministry job, I was literally sitting front pew the first Sunday that I could be back in there just as a regular congregant because I wanted to see the people. And I believe that's because my parents did a really good job of teaching me to love the people more than I ever loved a position.
That's really good.
And that's because they had me serving. They had me serving in kids ministry and everywhere, nursing homes, prisons, soup kitchens. My dad took us everywhere when we were kids. And so not just church people, but just a deep love for people in general.
Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah, deep love for people and reverence for God, right? Being obedient to what he's asked you to do. So that's awesome.
It's interesting how many pastors I talk with or read about or see on social media or whatever, where they actually, you almost question, do they love the church that they lead, right? Because they're very quick. They don't have to preach. They don't show up, right? They, and so one of the things that we talk about often is how much we just love church. And so when we're off, people will be like, well, why are you in church? Like, you shouldn't be here. Like, it's your day off. And we're like, no, but we are members of this church as well. Yeah. And we want to have an encounter with God. We want to hear the word of God preached, whether they work for us who's preaching or not, right? And so it's I think my hope is, we've talked about this, is that 20 years from now, we don't become, we transition out and then we're never in church. Yeah. Because it's like, oh, we did our time. We did our good work. And, and so I really appreciate what you're saying is really the root of it is, hey, we got to keep our love for the church.
Yeah, for the people, right?
And for the people.
Yeah.
The people, which is the church. Yeah.
Right. So we're super, super pumped that you're coming to our sisterhood conference and you're going to be sharing there very soon. And the theme for our conference is actually called Restore. So restore and taking it back to its original state, which is just everything that's kind of, in line with your book and in line with the conversation that we're having right now. So what tips, what encouragement would you have for those listening that want to restore their faith?
We have to go back to the basics of who and what we said yes to. I don't know if it's social media. I don't know if it's age. I don't know what it is, but we get really bogged down and confused easily by the noise that is all around us every day. Yeah. And whether it's our jobs, our families, our peers, our, working for a church, I don't know. we take it for granted. And so the basics for me have always just been worship, prayer, intercession, journaling, getting myself into the presence of God as often as possible so that his voice is the loudest voice that I can hear. Because, I watched my dad have a heart attack and almost die from ministry. And I can remember standing over his body, the doctor telling us to say goodbye, and hearing the enemy so clearly say, the church killed your dad. This will happen to you too.
Wow.
And thinking, wow, that would be a really good story when people ask me why I wasn't in ministry, that I would just say, well, the church killed my dad. So why would I want that for my life too? And then at the same time, though, like the louder voice was the voice of God, who was saying, look, I did it in the Old Testament. Jesus did it in the New Testament. Do you believe that I'm the same God then as I am now? Then tell your dad to take up his bed and walk. And the authority that I had in that moment to scream that over my dad's lifeless body, and for him to actually get up and walk out of that hospital 36 hours later. And so the prayer closet, those basics, that is what renews us. That is that daily getting with the Lord and letting him walk us through that, down those rivers of living water, that where he restores our soul, and we're able to just be brought back almost to like the reset factory button of our salvation, where we wake up and those mercies are new and all of those things. So not to forget, this world wants us to be influential, but we've been called to be authoritative. And we only can do that by getting back to those basics.
Love that. Back to the basics. Simple. Keep it simple. We overcomplicate it, and the noise distracts us, and the noise pulls us away from the foundation that Jesus built, really, on right? So I love that. It's so good.
We've been, as we wrap up, we've been over the last couple of years really intentionally praying for revival in our church. And one of the things that we continually tell our church, and I believe we're in revival now, but one of the things we continually tell our church is that the signs of revival, yes, are increased attendance. Yes, are baptisms, are salvations, are these numbers. But the true sign of revival is transformation, right? Will this last? Because we could go back. We've been in this charismatic word of faith area for many, many years. We could go back to how many revivals and they're gone. It ends, and what's the fruit of it, right? And so how important it is to stay rooted in the basics, right? Yeah. The basics.
Stay connected to the vine.
When people come, they're new to their faith, and they say, "What do I do? I want to grow my faith." Well, pray, worship, right? Be connected into community. Yeah. And so
read your word. Read the word.
Read the word, right? Read the Bible.
Let's not just have an Instagram faith. Let's actually open up our Bibles and read it for ourselves.
Yeah, and I think about even in Acts 2, as a Pentecostal kid growing up, we loved Pentecost Sunday. We loved, talking about the Holy Spirit. And yes, that was absolutely part of what happened in the upper room. But there was a lot of mixed reaction to what happened in the upper room. There were some people that were loving it. Others who were kind of like, whoa, wait a minute, they're drunk on wine. This isn't right? There was a skepticism in the room. And Peter, of all of them, Peter stands up, and it says, with the backing of the other 11, Peter begins to prophesy the prophet Joel and says, in the last days, this is exactly how it's supposed to go down. And people start repenting because they're like so heartbroken that they've questioned what they've seen. And Peter begins to preach this message where he basically is like, here's what you're going to do. You're going to repent because a lot of you have been led astray. You're the ones who were yelling crucify, and now you've seen that he's the true Son of God. You're going to forgive. You're going to break bread. We're going to baptize. And that whole thing that happened in the upper room is the recipe for revival. It is showing up every time we go into the church doors and expecting baptisms, expecting people to forgive, expecting people to be forgiven, expecting people to get saved. That's the anticipation of revival, not who's singing or preaching.
Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah.
That's a really good way to end.
Yeah.
So we want to thank you. First of all, congratulations on your new book. And of course, the success of the other book. And I'm measuring the success by, I don't know how many books you've sold. I'm measuring the success by the influence that you've had through it and how God's working through it. And we know you're incredibly busy, and everybody needs to know you're incredibly busy, but you made time to be on this podcast with us. And we're excited. In about less than 2 months, you'll be with us. And so we're praying for you. We're grateful for you. We want you to stay healthy, right? I know you just came off a sabbatical a few weeks ago. Stay healthy, stay strong. But did you want to say one?
Yeah, no, just thank you. Thank you for making time for us. Thank you for having this conversation. Thank you for writing these books. Thank you for, being obedient to what God's asked you to do, because it's impacting many people's lives. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Well, that is the first episode of season 2 of Beyond the Pulpit. Make sure to subscribe, to like, to comment, do everything you need to do to share, because this is a message. This is a podcast you want everybody to hear. Love you guys.